Hunter, what is your sports moving heartbreak story? Because everybody, I think, has one.
That is a super easy question for me because I grew up in central Connecticut. I was born in Hartford, and we had a team called the Hartford Whalers, which was a team in the NHL. Before that was in another league. But when I was a kid, they were in the NHL, and they weren't the best team, but they were Connecticut's only professional sports team. And I believe it was in 97 that they moved to Raleigh, North Carolina. And then pretty quickly after them won a Stanley Cup. So not only did they leave, but they had enormous success as soon as they left. And Ron Francis was a Whaler at the time that I was growing up. So, we had and Gordie Howe, really great players. And so for me, that was a disaster. I think for many people in Connecticut, even if they didn't particularly like hockey, they didn't love seeing the Whalers leave.
Yeah, I think broadly, anytime a team moves, it's going to be very painful for everybody involved. But I think to your point, Hunter, that Connecticut, it was the only major league sports team in Connecticut at the time.
They have a WNBA team now, so that's no longer true.
Now they have a WNBA team.
But yeah, for several years, there was no professional team. There's no hockey team. So, yep, that was a bummer.
Tough. I actually don't have a story off the top of my head. I'm originally from LA. LA did lose a couple of NFL teams at one point. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Yep. But that was before my time, and definitely before I cared about sports as much as I care about them now. So, and nothing has left Portland. So I think if the Timbers or Thorns or Blazers ever left Portland, that would be pretty tough for me.
Well, we lost the Portland Beavers, which was a minor league baseball team.
That is true.
And that was partially facilitated so that the Timbers could join the MLS. So that was, for you and me, probably not a big loss, but a bunch of people were bummed because they'd love to go to see baseball in Portland at that level. There's still some teams in the area that compete at a few leagues down from there.
Yeah, and not to get us too off topic, but the Beavers, that was an institution team. Like, they had been around for a long, long time. And
they came and left, which is on topic, right? Yeah. Because we're talking about that.
Exactly.
So they were around and then they left. But every time they came back, they would rename the team the Beavers to give it that coherence over time. And we'll explore some examples today of, when a team leaves, does it take its name with it, or does it have to leave the records behind or leave the record book behind? And that's all part of the very complicated topic that we're exploring today, which is geography is your sports team moving?
Yeah, exactly. So I actually don't know what the title of this is going to be yet. I haven't really figured out what the exact linguistic.
We can maybe come up with something catchy. Yeah,
it's going to be, but no, exactly. I think listener, as you're listening right now, you probably picked up on sort of where we're heading, that this is going to be sort of a episode on the how, whys, wheres, and causes of professional sports teams moving from one city to the next, and sort of what does that mean for people? What does that mean for cities? What does that mean for the leagues themselves? Where does this happen in the US, and where does it happen, maybe globally? So it's going to be a very fascinating topic, I think. And that said, I always like to do this anytime we have a sports episode, because I know that there are people listening to this who are not sports fans. That's totally fine.
Absolutely. Not everybody likes sports. And a lot of times when people don't like sports, they kind of really don't like sports, which is understandable.
That said, I'm going to let Hunter sell you on why you should still listen to this episode, because I think there is something here, even for people who don't like sports.
So I think on one hand, it's a bit of an episode about sports, but on the other hand, it's really, sports is an example of something much greater, right? And it's an example of how people relate to aspects of culture and connect themselves to places. And that happens with sports, but it happens with lots of other things as well, lots of other cultural institutions. It also has a lot to do with business and priorities for spending money. It has to do with stadiums and what gets funded and what doesn't. So even if you're not, super interested in sports, hopefully you'll stick with the episode, because it's an example of culture, popular culture, economics, the way that people connect to place, And you could really pencil in any number of different cultural moments, and there could be an analog discussion. So, if you're not into sports, that's totally okay. We hope you stick around. If you're into sports, then you'll probably have an easy time connecting to a lot of the examples that we're going to give.
Yeah, and I would say broadly, if you're interested in cities, this is going to be a good episode for you, because a lot of what we're talking about today, while it's going to be sports focused, so much of it ties into individual cities and sort of what that's going to mean for individual cities. For example, we're going to talk a lot about one such city, Oklahoma City, today, and because they have kind of an interesting story about how they sort of acquired their professional sports team that they own today, and sort of what that means to them. And it turns out it means quite a bit to people who live in Oklahoma City. So
yeah, it speaks to the competition among cities, to have a higher profile, to have recognition. And so that's something I think a lot of people will be interested in.
Exactly. So with that said, and I don't think we already mentioned this, but you're listening to Geography is Everything. That should be hopefully pretty clear. You clicked on this as to decide that you want to listen to it. Let's go ahead and jump into some background context. I think, as with all of our episodes, we're going to be going through some various terms here, or maybe not even terms, but just concepts that are a little bit different, especially if you're not from the US. And I think the first thing that we want to establish as we're talking about sports so much is the difference between how sports are really run in the United States specifically, and Canada, versus how it's run in a lot of other places, particularly with respects to soccer or football in the global context, not American football. And so if you are a US sports fan and you are a fan of the NHL, MLB, MLS, NFL, NBA, these are all what we would call a franchise system. And Hunter, what is a franchise system?
So a franchise system is when there is a organization, a league, that has a finite number of teams, and it's usually just their purview is the one professional league. It's not necessarily leagues underneath that, even though there is a minor league system that is related. And there's a fixed number of teams, and they're always in the league. And so franchises, with one exception, which we'll get to later, are generally owned by an owner or a small group of owners. And then those owners get to vote on whether, for example, to expand the league, to admit teams from other cities, or if a team wants to move, that usually has to be approved by the membership, which are the owners. And so franchises tend to have rights over particular markets and particular territories. Some big cities like LA, New York might have a couple teams, but smaller markets, they'll definitely just have one team. And if we look at another system we're about to talk about, many cities, even ones that are smaller, have multiple teams in soccer or another particular league. This franchise system dates back to the 1800s in baseball in the United States. And it sort of creates this artificial scarcity because many cities would like to have professional teams, but they have to wait for approval. There's kind of a monopoly situation that's sort of in effect. And that's also gives these league owners an enormous amount of power because they have the power to decide what the league looks like. Occasionally, a rival league will merge with a professional league, and this doesn't happen very often. Having said that, it did happen in American football and baseball and hockey in the United States in the last half of the 20th century, where you had some teams from a different league that sort of merged into this other league. But that's a very different situation than I think what we're talking about next, which is European leagues, for example, and soccer works like this in most parts of the world, where they're structured around promotion and relegation. And can you take us through that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a heady topic, but basically how it works is that there'll be a team generally anywhere within, let's say England, could start up. And that team would start at the lowest level of what would be called the pyramid. And on that pyramid is basically what it sounds, a lot of different teams sort of start down at the bottom. This would be anywhere from, depending on the countries, a sort of amateur to, semi-amateur to professional league. And as you play and you win your games and you sort of come out at the top of your league, you would be, if you came out at the top of the league, you would be promoted up to the next tier. The inverse is also true, though, right? Because if you're in that other league just above you and you're coming at the bottom, you would be relegated to the league below you. And in this way, it provides sort of an upward and downward mobility for teams that really, I guess, there. When we think about the differences between Europe and the U.S., we think about, the U.S. being a lot more capitalist heavy and Europe being a lot more socialist heavy in terms of safety nets. And there's debate on really how different they actually are, but that's the perception. And really, with our sports leagues, it's almost kind of flipped, right? The sports teams in the U.S. are franchise oriented. It's very sort of governed to ensure that there's a lot of protections for the owners and sort of the market capitalization for the teams. And in Europe, it's a lot more sort of laissez-faire, sort of capitalism, sort of competition kind of system. And that's really the very important difference between the two, because as you were alluding to, Hunter, when we were talking about the franchise system, the owners really do. I think all of the leagues have between 30 and 32 teams right now. And that would be NFL, NHL, MLS, MLB, and NBA. WNBA and NWSL, have fewer, but for the five big men's leagues, they all have between 30 and 32 teams. And when you do have that, you have a lot more sway if you were going to award a new franchise over a city or competing cities, or if you're going to move a team, than you would otherwise under this promotion and relegation model, where perhaps you don't have any sort of leverage to say one way or another where a team's going to pop up. So those would be the primary differences, and it really is focuses on the mobility of a team within a given structure. Franchise system doesn't really have any.
And one of the advantages for owners of a franchise system is that no matter how badly their team does, they stay in the top league. So they continue to share in television revenues and this kind of thing, and they don't get sent down to another league that has less revenue. And so that's one of the reasons why it would be very hard to affect a change in the way that the system works in the United States, because owners aren't going to agree all of a sudden to a system where they might find themselves in a situation where they're in a league that's not going to make as much money.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of what we're going to be talking today really does focus in on, well, what are the economics here? What's the monetary gain here? I mean, that's
a huge part of this conversation.
It's a huge part of the conversation. It's not the case always. We're going to talk about one instance of a brief move later in the episode that wasn't focused around the economics, but I would say the vast majority of them, there's some sort of economics at play for a reason why some teams move. And so with that, we've sort of established some key terminology. Hunter, do you want to jump into some early history of teams moving?
Yeah, sure. So, if you go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and you start looking at baseball in particular, because that was the sport that really grew with the growth of cities, with urbanization. The analog in Europe, most European places would be soccer, but in the United States, it was baseball. And it was fairly common for teams certainly to move stadiums within a city, but also move from city to city at times as well. So there were lots of different rival leagues, and moving from another city was not necessarily a rare thing. The reason that they moved stadiums a lot is because, they were putting these stadiums together pretty quickly. A lot of them were pretty shoddily built, and they were all built out of wood and had its unbelievable tendency to burn down to the ground. And so if you start reading about this, there's actually tons of examples of stadiums burning as well. So there was a lot of variable, a lot of moving around. So, for example, the Milwaukee Brewers moved to St. Louis and became the St. Louis Browns back in 1902. So here we're talking about major league, the top league kind of thing. If we look at regional leagues, there's lots of examples of this. Another really good example in baseball would be the original Baltimore Orioles moving to New York City to become a team called the New York Highlanders, which was then renamed in 1913 to the New York Yankees, which, if you don't know anything about sports, you've heard of before, right?
You've
so one of the most
storied
sports franchises in the country didn't start out in New York, but started in Baltimore.
Well, and I would say, as we're just talking about baseball here, because, to your point, Hunter, there's a lot of history of teams moving. I would say, and we might touch on this a little bit later, but in any league sort of founding, there tends to be a history of teams sort of moving around as the league is getting the ground under its feet a little bit. Baseball certainly has a lot of that history for everything you just mentioned. Stadiums were burning down, which kind of tracks with cities back then. Cities had constant issues with fires in the late 1800s, right. Early 1900s.
And the location of stadiums in the city was moving a lot because cities were growing really rapidly at that point. Industrialization was growing. And so stadiums that used to be closer to the center of things or in the middle of cities, eventually start working their way out to the periphery a little bit. Some of them have come back to the center city a little bit, the downtowns. But the economics of where it makes sense to, be able to finance a stadium is something that's changed as well.
Yeah. And I think, it's a little bit of a tangent because the thought just popped in my head was, there was a point in time when stadiums for baseball teams in particular sort of moved towards multi-purpose sort of mega stadiums that would be shared with an NFL team, for example.
That's exactly right. That was the 1960s and 70s. Yep. The all-purpose stadium. A lot of them look pretty similar to one another. They were mostly, this sort of round bowl type situation. Some of them were covered, and they would have the name Dome after it. So there was the King Dome and the Superdome, and there was a number of other ones. And so, that was very much a 60s and 70s moment.
Yeah. And if you're not at all familiar with baseball and NFL, you just know that the proportions of the field size are very different. So you get sort of these amorphous almost stadiums that didn't really feel purpose built. Since then, there's been definitely a movement back towards building what would be called a ballpark, quote unquote, rather than a stadium, right? So was it Camden? No, not Camden Yards. Camden Yards in Baltimore, I think.
Yeah, that was one of the ones.
One of the first.
It was sort of a throwback, right? A retro style thing, all made out of brick. But the idea was that it was going to host baseball, and you have a lot of, I think, hockey and basketball teams that might share arenas still, but fewer and fewer football and baseball teams are sharing stadium.
Exactly. And so, sorry, that was a really quick tangent, just because we were talking a little bit about stadiums and the idea just popped in my head. But going back to sort of some historic, really well-known baseball teams today that have, didn't originally start at, where they were founded. I have here, two really popular teams on the West Coast, the Dodgers and the Giants, did not start in either LA or San Francisco. Hunter, where did they start?
They both moved from New York.
New York. Well, Brooklyn, specifically for the Dodgers.
That's right.
Yeah. And I don't know how true exactly this is, but from my reading, they were called the Dodgers because people had to sort of dodge around these zipping, cable cars or street cars, XYZ.
We'd probably find lots of stories. That might be the case, but it's amazing that some of these teams, some of them are obvious how the name came up, but some of them are sort of shrouded in, mystery. There's like possible explanations, but those examples that you just gave are really important examples because they're part of what really expand the leagues to the West Coast and really make it a full coast to coast league. And, the Dodgers and the Giants are pretty storied, franchise storied teams. And, to lose for the Brooklyn to lose the Dodgers, I think was a pretty big deal for people, not everybody, but for a lot of people in Brooklyn. And that was seen as a loss of something that was intrinsically Brooklyn. And, we'll come across that sort of feeling a bunch when we talk about a team leaving. When I talked about when Hartford left the Whalers, I mean, it leaves a little bit of a cultural gap for some of the people there.
Yeah. And I think that's the most important thing to sort of take away from this episode is that, as these teams move, much to the benefit of the league or the owner, I would say oftentimes always to the benefit, that there's definitely a profound loss being felt within the community, not only culturally and, in terms of sort of the shared sort of symbology behind it, but also economically, right? Because a lot goes into these the teams there in terms of people spending money on them, salaries being, and jobs being supported by them, all this kind of stuff. And so when one of these things moves, that sort of takes with it all of that energy and all of that money. And so to your point, the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants, they moved to Los Angeles and San Francisco respectively in 1958. They were the first two teams on the West Coast for MLB. So that wasn't that long ago. LA and San Francisco in 1958, those were pretty mammoth sized cities at the time. So it was kind of, a big move for MLB to sort of make at that time.
There were a bunch of moves after that, because I think that sort of kicked off. I mean, there were a few moves before that too. So yeah, the Boston Braves moved to Milwaukee. The St. Louis Browns moved to Baltimore. The Philadelphia Athletics moved to Kansas City. But then after, those were all in the 50s. And then the 60s, you have the Washington Senators moving to Minnesota, becoming the Minnesota Twins, the Milwaukee Braves becoming the Atlanta Braves. You have the Los Angeles Angels moving to Anaheim to become the Angels. Kansas City to Oakland, Seattle to Milwaukee. We'll get more into that. So there was a lot of movement at this time.
Yeah, and not just within in baseball, right? There are other big moves happening.
Oh, absolutely.
Elsewhere. I think one of the most famous basketball teams, the LA Lakers.
That's right.
I'm from LA, Hunter. There's not a whole lot of lakes in LA.
No. But there are in Minnesota, where they're from originally.
There's a lot in Minnesota.
And so my parents are from Minneapolis, right? And so when they told me as a kid that the Lakers used to be in Minneapolis, I was stunned. I was like, really? I can't believe that, because the Lakers in the 1980s in particular were this team that won, it seemed like, just about every year. And it made sense when you use the term Lakers that it might be affixed to Minneapolis, but I was surprised to learn that. And, there's lots of other examples in basketball too. The Philadelphia Warriors became the San Francisco and then the Golden State Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
A team from Chicago, the Zephyrs, moved to Baltimore to become the Bullets. You had a team from Syracuse moved to Philadelphia. A team from St. Louis moved to Atlanta. And then throughout the 70s, almost every year, there were teams moving about. In 1979, the New Orleans Jazz moved to Utah and kept the name the Jazz, which is another one of those Lakers moments where it's like, wow, that's a pretty incongruent name for a team from Salt Lake, it would seem.
Yeah, I'm not from Salt Lake. I visited a couple of times. I wouldn't classify it as a jazzy city. It has a lot going for it.
Absolutely.
Nothing against Salt Lake. It's
right.
just,
not a jazz center.
Just not a jazz center, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas New Orleans, the birthplace of jazz, right? It makes sense a little bit more.
It makes a huge amount of sense there. So all that's to say, and as we're talking about names moving as well, we talk a lot about the symbology of a team moving and sort of what that means. But for example, when the Minnesota Lakers moved to LA,
I guess they were the Minneapolis Lakers, but
Minneapolis Lakers, yeah. It creates this sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Just sort of like confusion and sort of place identity confusion, where it's like people who certainly lived through that are now sort of left even almost with more pain because they see their place identity being attached to another place, right? And obviously, I don't have anybody on hand who sort of remembers when the Dodgers moved from Brooklyn to LA.
Right, but they would be called the same thing. Almost
they would be called the same
wound,
thing.
Right?
Would and we're going to get to a very specific example where this didn't happen. Although I do have a fun sort of tangent story about maybe why it actually could have made sense in this instance. Hopefully, people from Seattle don't kill me when I talk about that. But there's a fun story that goes with it. But I think broadly, as we're talking about all this, and we can go into a million different moves, right? There's so many teams that have moved throughout the history, and we're going to talk about some sort of pretty in depth because they have unique stories attached to them. But I think just knowing, at this point, listener, to keep in mind that each time one of these teams moves, that it's sort of a momentous occasion for both the city that it's leaving and the city that's receiving it. There's a lot of energy that's being transferred. And so I think with that, before we jump into maybe some recent history, unless there's some more, maybe we do a quick ad break.
Yeah, let's do that and we can pick this back up.
All right, here we go. And we are back. So we just ran through a lot of history around baseball, specifically around basketball. Let's get back into some hockey. Hunter, you led off with an interesting story about your personal experience. Let's talk a little bit about that sport at large and sort of how
Yeah.
they've handled movements.
So there was a lot of movement in hockey in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. One of the things that we should probably give for a little bit of context is that there was the NHL, the National Hockey League, but there was the WHA, which I think is the World Hockey Association. So this was a rival league.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1979, a number of teams that had been in the WHA were absorbed into the NHL. Three of them were the Winnipeg Jets, the Quebec Nordiques, and the Hartford Whalers. And all three of those teams subsequently moved to other cities a decade or so, and a few decades afterwards. And so these are all hockey places. I mean, Hartford, I guess, somewhat, but certainly Quebec, Winnipeg. Then you also have the Minnesota North Stars, and Minnesota is huge hockey state. And so the Minnesota North Stars moved to Dallas, and then they won the World Cup, the Stanley Cup, excuse me, in 1999 after doing that. But, one of the reasons for the move was a failure to get a new arena in either Minneapolis or St. Paul. And so Norm Green, who was the owner of the North Stars, was planning to move to Anaheim to play in a new stadium there. But Disney was creating a team called the Mighty Ducks before that could happen. And so the North Stars ended up moving to Dallas and becoming the Stars. And then subsequently, Minnesota did get an expansion team, which is called the Wild, which began playing in 2000. The Quebec Nordiques, storied team, moved to Denver to become the Colorado Avalanche, and then won the Stanley Cup the following year. And they won again in 2001, 2022. So this was another hockey, old town that had a lot of history with hockey, and saw their team move away. The Winnipeg Jets moved in 96 to Phoenix to become the Coyotes. And then subsequently the Atlanta Thrashers that began playing in 1999 moved to Winnipeg in 2011. But the example that I, want to hit on here is the Hartford Whalers. That's what I talked about at the top of the broadcast here. They were the only professional team, men's franchise in Connecticut history. They have the NWNBA team, Women's National Basketball Association team. Currently,
a lot of acronyms in this episode.
Right. The Whalers originally played in Boston from 72 to 74, something we don't emphasize in our history in Connecticut very much. They were part of the WHA. They moved to Hartford in 74 to play in the Hartford Civic Center, which is funny because that's the reason they left, was because of the Hartford Civic Center as well. Until 1979, they were the New England Whalers, but the Boston Bruins weren't too hip on the name because they're in New England too. And so the New England Whalers changed their name to the Hartford Whalers. And the owner of the team really wanted a new venue. And the governor at the time, John Rowland, was very reluctant to build a new venue or to push the building of a new venue. The owner wanted more money eventually they became to an agreement, but the owner wanted money for those years in which the arena would be built. And that's when negotiations fell apart. So the owner announced that the Whalers would leave Hartford without even having a destination city yet. Right? I think this is like
I didn't know that.
Rare case in sports where they wanted out of Hartford so badly that they didn't even have another city to go to. And there were a number of places that they were talking about moving to. But after talks with several cities, it ended up being Raleigh. And they moved to play in a new arena there, which I think was quickly built within a few years of them arriving. Hartford does have an AHL team, which is a minor league hockey. The Binghamton Rangers moved in 97 to become the Hartford Wolfpack. And the Wolfpack, incidentally, is a reference to submarines in the submarine industry, which is very big in Connecticut. So it's not the Wolfpack that you're thinking of.
Yeah.
And in the middle of 2010, 2011 season, the Wolfpack became the Hartford Whale, because people were just so nostalgic for the Whalers, I guess, at that point that they renamed it. And then
it's
3
still
years
a very
later,
iconic logo. Like I can picture it in my head. And
in sports, I think with the whale tail and the W and then the H in between. I mean, I'm super partial to this logo, but I think it's one of the great logos in sports. Anyways, the Hartford Whaler is now the Hartford Wolfpack again. And there was also a moment to tie this into the story that the Patriots, the New England Patriots, were talking about moving to Hartford. And, after having not really wanted to keep the Whalers there, working very hard to that, the governor was like, oh, wow, we need a major league sports franchise in our city. And they were willing to build this fantastically expensive stadium for the Patriots. Of course, that never ended up happening. And there was a new stadium that was built in Foxborough instead. So, I mean, one of the things that comes up in this story, and it'll come up in more of the examples that we look at, is the stadium is often very central to the scheme that the owner has. It's like, hey, I want a new stadium, I want a new arena, and if that's not done, then I'll just move the city to another place.
Right, which is something.
Move this team to another city.
Move the team to another city, and I think this is where the franchise system that we talked about earlier in this episode really comes into play. We talked about sort of the competition that a league was able to employ over various cities, right? When you have a finite amount of teams, let's say you're capped at 30 teams.
That's right.
And you have 40 cities that all want a team, it becomes very easy to leverage that to then get, such as the Connecticut governor, to try and lure the New England Patriots over to your district to then say, we'll throw in, I don't know, a lot of money. I don't know how much the latest one might have cost, but I would hazard to guess hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, tons of money, right?
So it's a lot of money that is at play here that, again, has a bigger geographic impact than just a team culturally leaving, or even just the economic impact of the jobs. Right now, there's this whole sort of statewide, especially for smaller states that spend a lot of money on these stadiums. Well, what does that mean for a lot of the other services that the state still is responsible for?
I mean, you're hitting on something that I think we should amplify that's really important as well, is that in the post-war era, so, from the 1950s on, it became increasingly common for cities to build part or all of a stadium on which the team would play. And then they often give them a very generous lease agreement to be there. And that was all part of luring and keeping the teams motivated to stay in the city. And this is different than it was in the United States in the beginning of the 20th century, and different than it functions in. I mean, there's certainly exceptions to this in other countries, but normally the cities don't own the stadiums. It's the teams that have the stadiums. And here the owners are able to say, hey, if I want some public financing for this stadium and I want this arrangement, and if not, then we might leave. And so, as you said, they have an enormous amount of leverage because of that.
Yeah, not only do they have an enormous amount of leverage, but when they don't own the stadiums themselves, well, who's paying the property tax on that?
That's right.
It's not the teams, right? And that's not the case everywhere. There are teams that do own their stadiums. That is a thing that does happen in the U.S., but a lot of them don't as well. And each stadium and team will have its own fully separate agreement with the city. So, even here in Portland, the Portland Timbers play in a stadium that's very old. I think the actual stadium itself is from 1923. The city has owned it for a long period of time, and the amount of money that the Timbers basically pay to the city of Portland for the lease of that stadium is basically nothing. I think it amounts to $30,000 a month or something like that. It's a very small amount of money. So all that's to say is that all of these stadiums and all the economics that get built into it, it gets very lopsided typically on behalf of the team itself.
Well, and here's an example for you as well. In Seattle, the Kingdome, right, which is where the Seahawks played and the Mariners played. And this is a stadium that wasn't around for all that long, really. And it was built, like I said, during sometime in the 60s, I think, when this kind of big, large, multi-purpose stadiums were built. And it was destroyed. It was incidentally, at the time, the Guinness Book World Records had it on as the largest building by volume ever imploded. So that's something
a fun fact. I see those pictures, and it is quite impressive.
It's pretty dramatic. But the taxpayers in King County or in Seattle or whoever financed that, they finished paying off the Kingdome 15 years after it was imploded. And so that shows you the leverage that teams had. Hey, want a new stadium? We might move. Whether the taxpayers are paying on it or not, these things get pushed through, and the taxpayers were paying for a stadium that had been imploded for 15 years further on.
So I think with that, let's keep talking about Seattle a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
So and we've just been talking a little about the Seahawks and their stadium, and that's a whole story unto itself, as you just shared a little bit of. But I think there's a bigger story with the Seattle Supersonics. And this is where I might get into a little bit of trouble towards the end with Seattleites, and in which case I apologize. I'm just going to make a quick argument at the end here for maybe one thing that people don't agree with. But that said, the Seattle Supersonics were an NBA team that started many decades ago, kind of irrelevant. And when it started, it was named for the aerospace industry that Seattle is kind of famous for, right? So
because Boeing is located there. Yeah,
Boeing is located there, and that also happened to coincide with a period of time when there was a lot of study into supersonic flights, and Boeing obviously had a huge hand in sort of a lot of the technology that goes into that, as well as NASA and all this other kind of stuff. So let's fast forward to closer to modern times. The Seattle Supersonics eventually would move to Oklahoma City, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means to Oklahoma City. But how this all sort of played out is kind of interesting. So the Seattle Supersonics were owned by Howard Schultz, the owner and founder of Starbucks, a mega corporation. Howard Schultz is a very wealthy billionaire. He has a lot of money to himself. He also had a number of other owners that also had a lot of money, I'm sure. And they played at what is formerly called Key Arena. Now, today, that Key Arena is now called Climate Pledge Arena. It's where the Seattle Kraken play as of a couple years ago. And Key Arena was built in 1962. So to their point, that's an old stadium. And so as they, were getting towards sort of the middle of the 2000s, say 2005, 2006, they started to enter into negotiations with King County and the city of Seattle to get a new stadium, right? At this point, or actually not get a new stadium, to just, put in a lot of repairs and changes to their current stadium, right? To the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. It was still going to be a lot. And the city ultimately decided not to pay for these upgrades. And so what ended up happening was Howard Schultz sold the team to somebody named Clay Bennett. And not that it's going to be a surprise. Answer is probably obvious, but Hunter, where's Clay Bennett from?
Oklahoma City, I believe.
Oklahoma City. And so this is where things get a little sticky. So if you're around, you were a Supersonics fan, you were living in Seattle, and you found out that your team was sold from Howard Schultz, a very well-known Seattleite, to Clay Bennett, a very well-known booster of Oklahoma City, there's probably some alarm bells starting to sound in your head. And this was all sort of happening, within the age of the internet. There was obviously message boards. There's a lot of media going around this. At the time when this happened, the intent was always for Seattle or the Supersonics to stay in Seattle. In fact, I even have a quote here in my notes from Oklahoma City as, a lot of this sort of hearsay was going on. The quote from the mayor of Oklahoma City said, I quote, "I think it's presumptuous to assume that Clay Bennett and his ownership group won't own that Seattle team for a long, long time in Seattle. It's presumptuous to assume that they're going to move that franchise to Oklahoma City. I understand that people are going to say that, but it seems to I understand that people are going to say that seems like a likely scenario, but that's just speculation."
So initially, it was all done under the auspices that the team would stay in Seattle.
Absolutely. Yes. And at the time, Clay Bennett did try to get another stadium built in Renton, Washington. If you're not familiar with the Seattle area, Renton's a sort of a suburb city-ish, maybe about 10 miles southeast from Seattle proper. And he asked the state to pay for about $500 million to pay for it. So if we go back to when the Supersonics tried to get the state and city to pay for upgrades to the stadium, it was not $500 million. And they said no. So you can kind of assume where this is going, right?
Yep.
Why would the city and state sort of change its mind? Obviously, this wasn't going to happen. The state said no. And really, this was the sort of leverage that Clay Bennett and his ownership group needed to officially make the justification to the league, the NBA league office, to actually facilitate the move to Oklahoma City. This was kind of always the plan. There's a really good book that I read. It's called Boomtown by Sam Anderson, who's a fairly well-known journalist who covers sports and culture. So he has a really good book about this. This was always kind of the plan. So Oklahoma City, let's take Seattle Supersonics out of this equation for just a hot minute. Oklahoma City has always wanted a major league team. Hunter, can you talk a little bit about why cities might want a major league team?
Well, I think that the idea, the perception is that if you have a major league team, that you're more likely to attract, for example, businesses that might have their headquarters there, and it's one of the venues in which they can entertain clients.
Mm-hmm.
There's this term, big league city, right? And so being a big league city carries with it that idea that you are a major city. It's sort of, in a geographical phrase, it puts you on the map. That it's good for the economy, it's good for jobs. So there's a bunch of sort of economic things that are pulled together, and that it provides this point of pride and place identity for some of the people who live there. So these things sort of get woven together, and lacking that suggests that the city is somehow maybe not at the top level. And so I think that's the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to sum all that up, having a major league sports franchise puts your city on the map in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
The business aspect really can't be understated. A lot of really large businesses like the executive suites because they like to invite potential sales or very important guests of theirs to these big events to kind of show off the cultural cachet of their city and to be able to, I think in theory, draw in additional investment. So Oklahoma City really, really wanted a major league sports team. And they wanted it so bad that far before they got the Supersonics, back in the early 2000s, in 2002, they built an arena for somebody. This
like
could
without
have been
even having a team lined up to play.
nobody.
In it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was called Ford Center at the time. I think now it's called Paycom Center. But they built this arena to hopefully lure basically either an NHL team or an NBA team. Now, obviously, it would be very hard to lure an NFL team or an MLB team or an MLS team to an arena. So that wouldn't really make sense. So they did at least have some sort of narrow focus on the leagues that they were trying to get in. And so they were ultimately unsuccessful in the early years, but they did get a little taste of what this might look like just shortly after 2005 when Hurricane Katrina devastated the city of New Orleans. And so obviously, not to get too off tangent with going to Hurricane Katrina, but New Orleans by and large was devastated and took a long time to recover. And included in that recovery that was needed was the arena that the New Orleans Pelicans was playing in. And so for 2 years, the team largely moved to Oklahoma City. There was a few games that were still played in their home city, but largely most of the time that team was a Oklahoma City team. And it was supported very well. It was very clear that there was this pent-up demand within the city for a major league team. In fact, the same Oklahoma City boosters, Clay Bennett and his group, did try to buy that team, the Pelicans, and officially move them to Oklahoma City. Ultimately, that didn't pan out. After a couple of years, the team moved back to New Orleans, and Oklahoma City was left with not only this original gap, this original space that they didn't have this thing, but now at perhaps an even bigger space that they were really feeling because they had tasted that major league sports flavor for a little bit. And now they really, really wanted it. So now let's jump back to 2009, right? So it was 2005 to 2007. There was a couple of years there where they didn't have a team. Clay Bennett buys the Supersonics, and now everything becomes pretty clear that from the onset, the intent was always for Seattle Supersonics to move to Oklahoma City. And so they did. As part of the move, the new owners agreed to keep the name Supersonics for Seattle. So they wouldn't take that. That was for the intent that, perhaps Seattle would get a team in the near future. Hasn't been near enough for, I'm sure, a lot of Seattle fans. But, they wouldn't take that sort of piece of history with them. However, the Thunder do claim Seattle's records, such as their 1979 championship, which is a little weird, right? And at one point, I couldn't find it on their website today, but at one point you could buy an Oklahoma City 1979 NBA championship t-shirt.
That's so bizarre.
Which is a little weird, right? And so this is where I'm going to go back to that name, right? So we talked a little bit about Utah Jazz, and how that name doesn't make sense, or the LA Lakers and how that doesn't really make sense given their respective locations. Now, obviously, the Seattle Supersonics have a really great claim to their name. There's home of the aeronautics industry and Boeing and all this kind of stuff. But there's a little known, maybe a little more known story about Oklahoma City where this name actually probably could have made sense for them in a very unique way. And that is the sonic boom tests that the city endured during the, I think it's 1960s.
Not what they wanted to emphasize, I guess. Yeah.
Probably not. I mean, it's a very interesting story. So I'll just very briefly run through it. The city was inundated over a period of, I think, 6 months to a year. I can't remember the exact amount of time, where the US government would fly supersonic planes over the city and create large booms, right? And if you've ever heard a sonic boom, it's quite loud and it disrupts your day quite a bit. And this went on for a number of time while the FAA was studying it and ultimately decided, that it wasn't worth trying to facilitate this technology over a major city center. It's not really the point of this conversation. What it is, though, is that supersonic, the name, kind of applies to both cities pretty equally well, as it turns out. There's definitely a history within Oklahoma City, a very unique history, I would say.
Well, to get a little deeper into the name with Seattle, so in 1962, I think it was, there was a World's Fair that was held in Seattle, and the Seattle Center was built up at that time. That's when the Space Needle was installed. And that's when Key Arena, which wasn't called Key Arena at the time, but that was built as part of that facility. And so when they got they got an expansion team, I think in the late 60s, the World's Fair, the whole focus was the technologies of the future. And so that sort of that was a World's Fair. That would be a great future episode for us, talking about World's Fairs, because you don't have so many of those anymore. But this was like a major effort for cities to launch themselves in the national and global consciousness as a place to go, as a place to visit, as a place to live, as a place to locate your business. And so that's where the Sonics came out of, that sort of 1960s vibe. And then I misspoke when I said that the Kingdom was built in the 60s. It was actually completed in 1976 and destroyed in the year 2000. So it was only around for 24 years, which is not a particularly long time for a huge capital investment like that, I would say.
No, and in a little bit, we're going to talk about a specific NFL stadium that has a similar lifespan, that's run into some very recent issues. But all this is to say is, and again, I can't recommend Boomtown enough. It was a very entertaining read, really just marking the whole story and how it ties into sort of sports and Supersonics and Thunder and the city at large. So I think the point to make here is that while the Seattle Supersonics leaving was a hugely momentous and tragic loss for people who live in Seattle, and I'm not taking that away from anybody who's in Seattle and desperately misses their NBA team. But the point to make here is just how much that really does mean to people in Oklahoma City. Because it really, like, if you watch a game, if you read anything about the history of the early years of the Oklahoma City Thunder, and at this point they've been around for over a decade, that really was a pretty powerful moment for the city in terms of how they identified themselves and sort of their city pride. And yeah, I don't know. I think it was just a really cool story. So check out that book if anybody's interested.
It's interesting that because we're talking about sports facilities, that some of which are publicly financed, that sort of raises a question. Now, there's a debate within societies and cities is, what should we be spending money on?
Mm-hmm.
And, for some people, it's not the stadiums, right? I mean, for some people, it's like, yeah, it's worth it. It's good for the city. It's good for business. It's good for lots of things. And then I think there's other people would make some pretty good arguments that, hey, maybe we should be spending this money on new schools
Mm-hmm.
or something else. And not that it has to be one or the other, but there's a finite amount of money that cities have available
Right.
to them. And there's as much, to get a bond measure or something across, you can't do that on everything. And so, you have to focus your energies in one area or not. And so, there've been a number of different academics who have written somewhat extensively on this hosting of major league teams and what that means for a place. And because often it is couched as jobs and money and financial development or economic development, these kinds of things. So I don't know if you might be familiar with these guys, Andrew Zimbalist and Roger Knoll, who are academics who've been around for a while. They've been publishing on this kind of thing for quite a long time. And if I can just share for a few minutes, some of what their main take home for this is that their argument is that the economic benefits are usually exaggerated. That when you hear a politician or you hear a town owner saying, hey, this, certainly it creates construction jobs for a while. It creates some jobs for a while, but, how often does a team play? That doesn't provide full-time work always for everybody who's involved in that kind of stuff. I mean, not to take away from the fact that some people make some of their money there, and that's really important. But there's a debate, in other words. A part of the argument that Zimbalist and Knoll make is that revenue that's spent at outings in a stadium often come at the expense of spending in another part of the city. So you might say, look at the increases that we've had, and certainly it's good for the businesses that are located near there. But that, according to some of their analyses, that may come at the expense of another part of the city or metropolitan area. They are critical of what we were talking about, the benefits of a major league city. There are a lot of hidden costs, sometimes additional infrastructure that has to be created. So even if the taxpayers aren't paying for all or any of a stadium or an arena, they might be having to finance some of the transportation infrastructure that goes into making it possible to get to those facilities. Measuring the intangible benefits of a team, and we've talked about what some of those are. That's, of course, very difficult to do because for some people it's priceless, and for some people you could put a price on it. I mentioned that they also raised the thing about, hey, we could be spending this money on schools or something else. And then there's a case study, and I don't know if this comes from them or for something else I read, but the Michigan governor at one point, circa, I don't know how long ago this was, probably over 10 years ago or something, approved plans for a new $650 million arena in Detroit, half of which would be financed by taxpayers, the same week that Detroit declared bankruptcy.
Wow.
So, and then the place that this arena is now, I believe, called Little Caesars Arena. So that's the corporate sponsor. Ended up costing over $860 million, opened in 2017. And it's where the Pistons play there now as well. And so that's gives you a pause to think about, wow, that's a very interesting moment where, and some people would argue that that's for the city, that's for the state, that's to generate income. Here's two people who've done a lot of research in this that question whether that might be the case or not. And then that big intangible of, sense of place and place-based pride, things that you and I have actually written quite a lot about in an academic mode. That's not something that everybody has, right? And so, who has the power to make these decisions? This is where it gets really complicated and murky. And we're sports fans, but I acknowledge that that's not a priority for everybody. And so it's interesting to think about, if you put that into the mix, it makes this team relocation story even more, I guess, compelling and murky.
Yeah. So you mentioned a keyword, which was sense of place. And the reason why that struck a chord with me is because there's one team that I think we should talk about briefly, maybe before our next ad break, and that is the Green Bay Packers.
I knew you were going to say the Green Bay Packers.
It's gotta be, right? Because there can't be another, certainly US-based sports team that is so iconic of its place than the Green Bay Packers.
Well, it's a very small market, right? I mean, Green Bay is not a big place, but many people, why do people know about Green Bay? Well, a lot of people know about this place because there's a very famous professional football team from that place.
Right.
I mean, of course, they're also run in a way that's different than other football teams and other professional teams. In fact, they're sort of allowed to operate this way, but other teams wouldn't be allowed to operate this way. And they have shareholders. I believe there's 32,000 or something like that. These are
A
people
lot more.
have they expanded it? At one point, they had a fixed number. What do you have?
537,460 stockholders.
Wow. So initially there must have been that smaller number.
Mm-hmm.
And these are people who ostensibly vote on what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't really fit with this franchise model where you have the majority owner who gets to vote. And, if you look at other places in the world, and Spain is a really good example, there's a handful of soccer teams in La Liga, which is the top professional soccer league there, including FC Barcelona, Real Madrid, Athletic Bilbao, that are owned by club members, basically, people who are members of the club. In the case of FC Barcelona, it's over 100,000, and they vote for who the president of the organization is going to be instead of having an owner decide. So this is actually a pretty rare model, even in Europe.
Yeah,
but the Packers have kind of that model, and I think what we're leading up to is that the Packers are unlikely to ever move in the same way that these other teams.
Yeah, because even beyond just being stockholders, they have a stipulation that no one is allowed to own more than 200,000 shares or 4% of the total. So, if they didn't have that stipulation, in theory, some billionaire could probably come along and amass 51% of the shares and then
have control.
But whoever thought of that thought well in advance of, maybe some of this stuff happening. And now that basically becomes impossible, right? And to your point, Green Bay is the only team with this sort of public form of ownership structure in the NFL. It was grandfathered in when the NFL's current ownership policy that stipulates a maximum of 32 owners per team was established in the 1980s. So any other team can have a maximum of 32 owners. Certainly, it's not going to have 537,460 owners. So to all that point, yes, the Green Bay Packers, you all are probably pretty safe, despite the fact that there's only about 320,000 people in your metro area, which would make it much, much, much smaller than basically any other major, quote unquote, big league sports city. Very interesting, very fascinating story. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to our last ad break, and then we will come back and finish this episode up.
We'll be right back.
And we are back. So we're sort of barreling towards the end of our episode here, but let's go ahead and talk about sort of maybe get back a little bit into the geography of major league sports. So we've talked a lot about what it means to be a big league city, a major league city, versus what it means when you don't have one of those teams, or what it means when you lose one, such as the Hartford Whalers. But who's making these decisions, right? There's usually some sort of economic component here. If we sort of made this comparison earlier, if there's 30 teams in your major league and 40 teams or 40 cities that can potentially have a major league city, who's deciding what those 40 cities are? And I think that's open for debate, but there is one organization that has tried to, math this out a little bit. And it's an organization called Smart Asset. And so they pulled together, or they maybe hired out for a study to be done on which cities have too many professional sports teams and which cities have too few, based on some sort of economic model.
It's kind of an interesting way of phrasing things, but let's go with
definitely.
it.
Yeah, it's fun. It gives us something to talk about a little bit. And they have a little formula here. I'm not going to read out the formula because it just really wouldn't make any sense just sort of me talking about it. But I can leave a link into the show notes for everybody to look at. But they come up with some interesting sort of ideas, I would say. And so as part of this study, they pulled together basically a top 10 cities with too many sports teams and a top 10 with too few. And when we're saying major league sports teams, they only ran it on the quote unquote big four. So that would be the NFL, MLB, NBA, and NHL. And so I would argue today MLS would probably be included. Now they have, multi-billion-dollar TV contract and all that kind of stuff. this was done in 2015, so maybe MLS wasn't quite at that point yet.
Quick side note that the MLS runs differently than the other leagues because it's essentially one economic entity in a way that the other leagues are not.
Oh boy, I didn't want to get into it, but yeah, it's so much different.
So when a player signs they're signing with the league, they're not really just signing with a team. This is another conversation for another day, but it's worth mentioning that they have a very different model.
Yeah. So all this is to say is Smart Asset compiled all this information and basically determined based on population and average household income about how many major league sports teams any given city should have. And so, Hunter, I don't know if you have the study in front of you, but would you be able to guess what the number one city that has too many professional sports teams would be?
I've got the list in front of me, so I'm not sure I can give an honest guess.
Well, is as you're looking at it, is that top city surprising to you?
I don't know, a little bit maybe. I mean, yeah. I'm still getting over the idea of too many teams, but I think I understand where they're coming from.
Where they're coming from, yeah. So the top team that they have listed here with too many professional sports teams is Denver, Colorado, and Denver has 5 professional sports teams if we're including MLS, but it has one professional sports team in all of the sort of NHL, MLB, NBA, NFL. And according to their math, with a population of about 2.6 million and an average household income of 84,000, they should have 1.6 teams. So they have a surplus, quote unquote, of 2.4 professional teams. So that's kind of how this math is starting to work out. And there's a number of other teams here. So it says, number 2 is San Francisco, Oakland, which here obviously has, they're saying that they have 5 teams. Obviously, since then, the Raiders have left and have moved to Las Vegas, so they actually don't have that many teams. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. If we go down to the other list, because I don't want to spend too much time on this study, but if we go on to the other side, the top cities with too few sports teams, again, Hunter, I'm going to ask you, is the top 2 or 3, or do these look maybe surprising to you?
Well, it's interesting that New York is on this list, and they've got a bunch of teams, but there are so many people there that by this model they should have more. Los Angeles also is on there, but then they're the only 2 cities that even have any teams of those 4 major leagues here. And Hartford is on the list here, tied for number 8 with Providence, Rhode Island nearby.
Well, and one other city that's on this list that now does have a couple different teams is Las Vegas, right? So, as of 2015, when this study was done, they had 0 actual teams. This study is saying that they should have at least 1. And so now they actually have 2, the NHL's Golden Knights and now the Raiders. And the top city here would be the Riverside, San Bernardino, California area, which is not quite a suburb of LA, though there's a lot of movement back and forth between these, sort of commuting patterns, or at least historically. They have 0 teams or 4.3 million people. They're saying that there should be 2.3 teams. It's very interesting. So just to close us out of this, I'm going to read sort of their hot takes on what should happen. And I'm going to classify this one more time. This is not coming from me. I'm not advertising for this. I'm just reporting here because it is quite funny. So some of the stuff I think they nail pretty easily. So the first one here is, this is their segment is called, so who should move where? And the first one is they should move the Oakland Raiders and the Denver Nuggets to Riverside and make them the Riverside Raiders and the Riverside Nuggets. Now, I know quite a few Nuggets fans in Colorado, and they're probably pretty irate at that suggestion right now.
Yeah, I don't know.
The next one is move the Phoenix Coyotes, that's in the NHL, to Bridgeport. And this is quote unquote where it actually snows.
Right. So back to Connecticut here.
So they're getting a little cheeky, They say ship the Minnesota Timberwolves, also of the NHL, to New York City and rename them the Staten Island Slammers, which is kind of interesting. I think New York already has 2 or 3 NHL teams, but I guess to your point earlier, there's just a lot of people
there. The Timberwolves, though, is the basketball team, right?
Oh, is it? Okay, you're right. So Wild. Yeah. Sorry, I got my teams mixed up. So, but they still have a couple of basketball teams. So. But again, to your point earlier, New York City has a lot of people, so they could probably support more. Here's one that they correctly called. They said, send the St. Louis Rams to Los Angeles. And obviously that did happen.
That did happen.
They say take the talents of the Cleveland Indians, now called the Cleveland Guardians, to Austin, Texas, and rename them the Austin Argonauts. I don't know where they're getting sort of the name changes from.
Don't take the talents as a riff on the LeBron James announcement thing too. So they're definitely weaving in. They're trying to needle people a little bit with some of their descriptions here, I think.
Here they're saying people should specifically leave Detroit and Buffalo alone, which I thought was funny. They say, okay, you're gonna like this one. Bring the Whalers back to Hartford by relieving Tampa Bay of their hockey team. Well, and then send the Rays, the Tampa Bay Rays of MLB, to Virginia Beach.
Interesting.
Don't know if that makes sense. I'm not familiar with Virginia Beach at all, which I think is like Norfolk area. This one is going to sting a lot of people. It says move the Pittsburgh Steelers to Las Vegas.
Oh my goodness. And again, let's emphasize we're not suggesting or advocating that. We're merely reporting on what Smart Asset has talked about. That's right.
Pitchforks at Smart Asset, not. And then they end this, again, this has all been sort of cheeky. They end this sort of bullet point list and say, run for cover, which is kind of what we're doing now. And so I think we'll probably leave you all with that. I don't know of any teams that are on the verge of moving today. There might be some whispers here and there. Obviously, the LA Rams and the San Diego Chargers, that was pretty recent, as well as the Oakland Raiders. But I don't know of anything off the top of my head, but it's probably not too far away. I think there's always some sort of...
That's the important point to make, is that whether there's a move or not, the owners also have the constant power to threaten to move. To try to get a better deal for, revenue. And that's also part of this, is the stories of when a team doesn't move, but a city has to make some big changes and has to foot the bill for an owner who is threatening to move.
Yeah. So your city could be next, on either on the receiving end or the leaving end. So Hunter, you want to run through some pluggables?
Sure. Thank you. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm co-host of this podcast. I'm also a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm the co-author of 2 cultural atlases, Portlandness, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, co-authored by David Banis and with contributions by many talented colleagues, including Geoff Gibson.
Yeah, thank you. And like he said, my name is Geoff Gibson, co-host of this podcast, as well as the host of the YouTube channel Geography by Geoff, as well as just a general fan of geography. I don't know. We really encourage you guys to go and subscribe to us over at our Substack page. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com, where you can get even more geography from us. And if you like this episode, you like what you heard, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you use. If that option allows for you, we really appreciate that kind of stuff. It really helps us out, to be honest. So, and with that, I guess we will see you next time, or you'll hear us next time.